Hello, everyone. It's Aunt Nikki of Your Story Hour, and I'm looking forward to our next chapter in Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and Still Mo by Sam Campbell. You guys ready? It's chapter 24, and it's called What's It? Sometimes I wish I could get a look behind the scenes on the other side of some of our forest adventures. Always our conclusions and descriptions must be from our human viewpoint. Do you suppose Eeny and Mo ever had yearnings for the human companions they once knew? Of course, such longings would have been of lesser influence than the instincts which led them to go forth into the world, out and beyond, else they would never have left the island. But I think we have reason to believe that such desires are within their hearts. Their extreme excitement when they first saw us after our long separation showed there was some longing or cherished memories that the meeting gratified. Then, too, we may be sure their mental life is somewhat similar to our own, for after all, we residents of this earth are made up of the same substance. I imagine a considerable stir was afoot in the little minds of two other red squirrels that came out to greet us rather noisily one dawn. Their chosen country was Point Trail's End to the west of our island, lying at much greater distance from us than the points occupied by Eeny and Mo. It was a beautiful daybreak they looked on. That is, if they stopped chasing each other long enough to see it. Mackerel clouds filled the eastern sky, and the rising sun lavished its red hues upon them. The color rose to the zenith, lighting the horizons. The lake, with not a single wrinkle of a wave to mar its placid face, mirrored the exquisite display above it, while tiny curls of vapor arose from the water to add a touch of mystery. Birds looked on this glory and sang until it seemed their throats could not stand the strain. From the moment the world began to shed its night robes and don the light of day, the two squirrels had been afoot. Their incessant chatter sounded as if they were staging the battle of the century. Over the ground, around tree trunks, through foliage they raced, one pursuing the other as if he would rip him to pieces if he ever closed that last 3 feet of distance. The gap remained, and the pursuer did not catch the pursued. Whether the two diminutive creatures were quarreling, or if this was a kind of sport, was a secret they carried along with them. There couldn't have been anything so very ill-humored about it, for occasionally they would stop and rest, perfectly only 6 feet apart. When both were ready, the chase would begin again. So noisy were the two squirrels that they attracted the attention of the one human being who was out to see the coming of the dawn. Duke wanted to get as much of that as possible on his last 2 days at the sanctuary, had risen while it was still yet dark, and launched out into the canoe. He was near this point when the red squirrel rumpus began, and he drifted close in to shore, watching the dawn unfold in the east, and at the same time keeping track of the excitement on shore. Can you see? There's one squirrel, and there's the other. I knew what Duke thought as he watched the two animals, and why his heart pounded a little faster as a question came in his mind. He could tell me this, and did so later. But I wonder what went through the minds of those little creatures in the moment when they had paused in a tree that overhung the water, and looked down on the drifting canoe and its occupant. Did the tall young man with dark curly hair, kindly face, and eyes that flashed with excited interest look familiar to them? Did they feel a little quickening of the pulse, and dig up old memories that had been stored away in half-forgotten corners of their hearts? Did they, too, question, "Is it he?" How could they know for sure? Certainly it looked like him, but then those human beings all look much alike, and they are always changing their skins from one color to another. Still, this one did look and act in a way that was familiar. Even if human beings look pretty much alike, they don't act alike. and this one was already showing a certain attitude of kindness similar to something they had once loved. Anyway, why was he acting so strangely? Other human beings would look up at them, make a remark or two in a tongue they did not understand, and pass on. But this one plainly was excited. He was making a little clucking noise, different from the sounds generally given by the two-legged creatures. Also, he was climbing out of the floating log in which he had been riding and was walking towards the tree in which they still stayed. His face was alight with interest and excitement, but there was no threat in his attitude. Hadn't they seen just such a creature do this before, way back in the remote childhood nearly a year ago? Could it be that this was the human being whom had fed them when their mother failed to return? Surely that was the way he looked, and that friendly expression now so clear on his face was like the one they had seen from their improvised nest. But how could they be sure? They chattered in soft voice to each other as the idea grew on them. It looked like him. It acted like him. Yet maybe it wasn't. And away they went to the very top of the tree. From their high perch they scolded the whole world that had so much deceit in it. Better not have anything to do with the race-like human beings, some of whom can be kind, while others can be cruel and kill just for amusement. But the man on the ground below would not let them alone. That clucking noise came again. He was calling their names that sounded remotely familiar. Maybe they had better take another close look, but it was just as well to be cautious. They would pull the old red squirrel stunt of staying on the far side of the tree trunk and just peeking around at him quickly. Don't give him a chance to draw a bead on you. Just look and then run. And so the two of them came down the tree, whimpering and whimpering, increasing their alertness and cautious as they neared the man. But now what was this fellow doing? What was that he was tossing up in the air? Was it a stone he was throwing at them? No, he wasn't trying to hit them, just attract their attention, and he succeeded well. That thing he was tossing up, wasn't it the kind of nut they had known when they were babies? It had been found on the island where they spent their childhood, and they hadn't found it since. Boy, but it was good, remember? Probably they mentioned the squirrel equivalent of the biscuits that Mother used to make. They had often said they would trade a bushel of acorns and pine cones for half a dozen of those things. How they wished they might catch the one he was handling now. Their eyes followed it as it rose and fell. But come to think of it, wouldn't that sort of prove that this was the human being they once knew? Other people had come before beneath their tree, going by in fishing boats, but they hadn't tossed any of those nuts up in the air. Maybe the miracle had happened, and this man they remembered as a friend had managed to get through the winter alive. They couldn't understand why he had, though. He didn't store up any food that they could see, hadn't made a home in a tree and lined it with cedar bark, hadn't grown thicker hair to meet the cold. But funny things happen in this world. They would test him anyway. They would go close, watching him all the time, and then, while still far enough off so he could not reach them, scamper high in the trees. This they would repeat until, if he were the wrong kind, he would get discouraged and go away. The man did not go away. He coaxed and coaxed them to come, and he kept calling those names. What was it he said? Meeny and Miney? Say, that was it. The very sounds that island human beings used in calling them when those nuts were being showered on the ground. It must be him. Guess they had better take the chance. The man was holding a nut towards them now. Dare you take it? Maybe one said to the other. I never take a dare, and the other perhaps, said the other. So he snatched it and ran. Hooray! It was one of those old-time nuts and just as good as ever. There could be no doubt about it now. Peanuts proved this was their childhood friend, the big fellow with the enormous but kindly hands, the one who used to laugh so much. "Come on, let's get us another peanut. Certainly it's safe, and kind of good to see this creature again." From Duke's standpoint, he knew he had found the last two of the squints. When he drifted along the shore and saw two very small chickarees racing about, he gave immediate attention to them, for there was a certain hope in his heart. Besides, Duke felt sure there could be only one red squirrel as saucy and quarrelsome as he who was doing the chasing. It would have to be Meeny. Then when he came beneath the tree in which they had paused, there was that little chattering note of excitement which had been so obvious in Eeny and Mo when they were found. He decided to try the peanut test. That would prove it conclusively. So for about an hour he stood beneath the tree, looking up until he had a pain in the neck, coaxing and coaxing. At last Meeny, wise and tough old Meeny, came and took a peanut from his fingers. A moment later, Meeny came for the offering. There could be no question about it. These were the last two squints. Duke dropped several handfuls of peanuts on the ground and hurried home to tell us the news and to get some breakfast. "I've got 'em! I've got 'em!" he announced excitedly as he came to the cabin. "Yes, I know, Duke," I said as I met him at the door. "You've got 'em! But why tell the whole world about it?" "No, I don't mean that. I've got Meeny and Miney. They are over at Trail's End. I gave them the peanut test, and they are our squints." We had to go and see. Breakfast was eaten at high speed. Then Giny, Duke, and I headed for the land of Meeny and Miney, going in 2 canoes as Duke planned to stay on. A little search was necessary to find the 2 squirrels. They were resting in after their strenuous morning. The peanuts Duke had left on the ground were gone, but by persistently calling their names and tapping with the peanut on the tree where Duke had seen them earlier, we finally stirred them up. Meeny was in the tree, and we discovered the little rascal peering down at us from high in the foliage. Meeny came running over the tree branch road a few moments later. They had to conquer fear once more, now that there were several of us. But before many minutes had passed, our old-time red squirrel pals were taking peanut after peanut from our outstretched hands. They would not permit us to touch them. The wilderness had entered their ways too much for that, and while we would have liked to pick them up and wool them around as we used to, it was better this way. There was something particularly attractive in the way they clung to the wilderness caution, yet bridged it sufficiently to come to our fingertips. Something said, "Thus far and no farther," and while we liked this feeling of their remaining in their world while we remained in ours, yet each of us free enough of fear to shake hands. "Boy, oh boy, that was swell," said Duke of the whole adventure. The forest world had revealed our little friends to us once more, and there was joy in our hearts. Duke had the what's-its as we walked through the woods together for a few minutes before Giny and I returned to the work of the cabin. One thing after another he pointed out with simple question, "What's it?" He asked the question when indicating the sweet fern. I named it for him and showed him how to identify it by the shape of its leaves and its very woody stem. Then I had him crumple its leaves in his fingers and note the mint odor that came from it. This is the plant preferred in making a smudge for driving mosquitoes from a tent, for its scent is pleasant to us, but not by the tiny insects. "What's it?" This time he pointed to a growth on the side of a dead tree. It was the shelf fungus which lives on and amid decaying wood. Sometimes these odd and attractive plants are highly colored, giving a decorative effect to the woods. "What's it? What's it? What's it?" Duke was boiling over with questions. We identified many things for him. There was the skunk cabbage growing low to the ground with its compact mass of insignificant flowers, giving out its skunk-like odor when bruised. There was the moose wood, with the zigzag twigs, a shrub from which Indians obtained long strips of bark to lace their birch bark canoes and perform the function of rope and string. There was the Indian turnip, or jack-in-the-pulpit, with its strange, like concealed flower that suggests a tiny pulpit with Jack delivering the sermons. There were the dainty little fairy trumpets, decorating decaying logs and stumps, sharing their world with fern moss and lichens. It was only when we stood at the canoes, Giny and I to return to the cabin and Duke to continue in the forest, that we discovered no one had thought of Duke's lunch. Meeny and Miney had produced too much excitement. But Duke decided he would go on without it. He figured it would increase his appetite to go without lunch, and he warned Giny she had better nail the tablecloth down at dinner time, or he might eat it along with the food. "What would you do," he asked, "if you were caught in the woods without food?" "It would be tough right now at this season," I replied. "No berries are ripe as yet. Better not try mushrooms unless you are sure you know them. You could eat some of those young fern leaves the Indians did. The inner bark of the birch tree has some nourishment to it if you can stand the taste. You could catch a fish and eat it raw, or you could locate an old porcupine, hit him across the nose, and dine on him." "That's enough," said Duke emphatically. "I'll wait until I get home, if you please." Duke came home a bit earlier than we expected. I wasn't surprised, for this business of going without lunch is not so much fun in the forest. But he had the funniest expression. It was what might be described as a long face, and yet not in the sense of being gloomy. It was simply long, his lower jaw pulled down, his lips apart, and his cheeks drawn. "Welcome, old top," I called to him as he approached the cabin. "Aren't you a bit ahead of yourself?" His reply simply cannot be described. He said something, but it had less resemblance of words than any sound I have ever heard a man make. Have you ever heard a sink that has been stopped up suddenly start to gurgle? Well, that is something like it. And along with this was another noise like what a man would make if a grasshopper was hopping down his throat. If I were to spell the sounds, it would have been blipped, blipped, har, har, blipped. And Duke looked for all the world as if he was trying to talk with an egg in his mouth, an ostrich egg at that. "What on earth has happened to you, fellow?" I exclaimed, going to him. Giny came from her dinner-making, much concerned. There was a smile in Duke's eyes as he repeated his curious noises, and certainly he couldn't smile anywhere else. Giny was a little impatient with me when I started to laugh. But I knew what had happened, and I knew Duke was not in serious trouble. With deliberation, I took a pencil and a pad of paper from my desk and handed them to him. "Now, my boy, I think I understand this," I said when I could hold the laughter down. "If what I think is true, you are not going to be able to talk or eat for several hours. Tell me, Captain Duke, did you by any chance get hungry and eat some Indian turnip?" "Blip, blip, har," he began. "No use, Duke," I said. "Just write it, please." He wrote the simple words, "Yes, I tried it." "That is what I thought, you monkey. Please tell me quickly that you did not swallow any of it." "Couldn't," was the written reply. Duke had played a trick on himself that has been used by practical jokers in the woods for years. The Indian turnip is not poisonous, but it has a peculiar effect on the tongue and cheeks when it is chewed. The tongue will pucker and swell until it fills the whole mouth. Many a tenderfoot has come north with a party of his pals on his first fishing trip to find them most generous in offering him a bite of rare Indian plant that they had found. It is something extra special, but as he chews, he feels a very odd sensation in his mouth. His tongue is tingling and swelling, his cheeks puckering. Presently his tongue is so large he can neither talk nor swallow. Then his dear pals gather about him to call him names and ask him why he does not talk back. After a few hours, the swelling leaves the tongue. Then the tenderfoot tells his companions what he thinks of friends who have treated him like that, and he secretly plans the day when he can do the same to some other innocent. Going without lunch had not been easy for Duke. We learned through much writing he had wanted food. He tried the inner bark of a birch tree, which said he would rather eat rubber. Ferns weren't so good either. He saw a porky, but certainly couldn't relish him. Then he spied the plant I had identified as Indian turnip. He had always liked turnips, cooked or raw, so he dug one of this wood's varieties, washed it up in Vanishing Lake, and began chewing on the woody fiber. He said his tongue puffed up like a balloon tire, and he figured he'd better come home and find if there was any way to deflate it. We threatened to eat our dinner while Duke looked on in helplessness, but we couldn't do that. Giny placed the food in the oven while we reduced the size of Duke's tongue. Gradually his words became more distinct, and at last he sat at the table and ate as much as 3 men generally do. I never knew how important the tongue is, Duke declared. Believe me, I am going to be careful how I use mine from now on. All right, we'll see you guys tomorrow.